If you're feeling stuck working in your podcast rather than growing it, this is going to be a breakdown of what you need to do to grow your show without feeling the podcast overwhelm. Welcome to the Podcast Café, where we're serving up everything you need to know about podcasting, from tips, stories, and strategies for podcasters from podcasters. I'm your host, Haley Hayhurst, the founder of Espresso Podcast Production, a full-service podcast agency helping business owners, creatives, and thought leaders launch and grow their shows. Whether you're just starting out or want to take your podcast to the next level, this is the place for you. Each week, we'll dive into practical tips, actionable strategies, and of course, stories from other podcasters so that you can build up a podcast that you love and that works for your business. So grab your coffee, get comfortable, and let's get started. Welcome to the Podcast Cafe. Hey, welcome back in the Podcast Cafe. I'm your host, Haley Hayhurst, and today I'm talking about a topic that I'm very passionate about: working on your podcast versus in your podcast and what the difference is. So oftentimes I get asked questions about podcasting, and commonly they're about, how do I grow my show? How do I get new listens? How do I get to the next level? And my question to the podcaster is always, okay, well, what are you doing to grow your show now? And 100% of the time, they are not promoting it enough or promoting it in the right way. And so I ask them more questions, and ultimately what it comes down to is spending too much time on the podcast work, such as editing, such as creating those graphics, such as, the detailed show notes, and not enough time on the needle moving things, such as promoting it, marketing it, coming up with that great content that will get the listeners back week after week. If you're someone who, and this is common, but records their content right as they're posting it, I would really encourage you to do a little bit of planning, and sometimes it's just not possible. I work with a lot of business owners, and so they're growing their business and growing their podcast, and ultimately they just don't have enough time for it all. So that's really where I come in to help you. So I'm going to break down working in your podcast versus working on your podcast, and then I'm going to give you some solutions to the problem. So what I mean by working in your podcast is doing like the day-to-day tasks like recording, editing, and social media posts. Whereas working on your podcast is more high level, such as strategy, growth planning, and monetization. So how is it going to feed into your bigger business plan overall? Since I do work with a lot of business owners, their podcast should be complementary to their business, right? I want people to be able to listen to your podcast and ultimately know exactly what you're doing in business, so then they can become either your clients or, buy into whatever it is that you're doing. So here's some signs that you might be stuck working in your podcast. If you're constantly scrambling to meet those deadlines, such as recording, or even when you do record an episode and it's great and you put it out, do you have time to post about it? The second one is you don't have time for thinking about the long term. So like I mentioned, recording lots and lots of content, pushing it out, and then not being able to really get it to the next level and strategize it. This could be also seen as recording a bunch of episodes that are aligned to your business, but then you don't have time to really think about how it feeds into the bigger picture. Like, are you going to run a commercial? Is there a launch that you have coming up? Really, what's the bigger goal by putting out every single podcast? Because every single podcast episode is a new way to reach a new audience, but you do have to have that goal and strategy in mind when it comes to it. Another sign that you might be stuck working in your podcast is if you're feeling overwhelmed or burnt out. If you're thinking, if I have to edit one more episode, I am going to lose it. I'm burning my podcast to the ground. That's really a sign that you're doing too much and you're working too much in your podcast. Another sign is just lack of consistency. If you put out an episode and then the next one comes out whenever you have time to record again, then that's really a sign that it might be time to have someone on your team to help you with podcasting, maybe outsource it a little bit more, or have a bigger strategy in mind so you know exactly what you're working towards every week. If you have consistency, then it is easier to know what the goal is of the podcast. And then beyond that, it might be time to hire an editor or a producer or a manager or have someone on your team do it. There's really a lot that you can do if you're stuck working in your podcast to get out of it. So if that sounds like you, that is okay. Because just like I mentioned, these are the pieces of the podcast that you can really outsource. These are the pieces of the podcast that you can really get help with. And so when you do decide to hand off your podcast to a producer like me or just anyone, this is really the benefits that you'll see, because then you'll be able to work higher level on your podcast rather than in your podcast. So I want to go over some of the benefits that you'll see. So ultimately, you'll be able to see the bigger picture that you're working towards on your podcast. When I start working with clients, I always do a kickoff call with them and I ask, what do you want to achieve in the next 1 year, next 3 years, next 5 years in your business? And how are we going to make your podcast correlate to that? I do have some clients that are building a brand around their podcast, but the question still remains, what do you want to achieve from this in the short term and long term? And when you're not working so heavily in your podcast, you really get to have that time back to work in the bigger picture. You're also going to be able to have more time so you can actually plan out your content so it aligns with your business goals, such as if you have let's say you have a big launch coming up in March, then you can look backwards and say, okay, if my launch is in March, what podcast topics do I want to cover up until then so my audience is prepared for this launch to come? Or if you're really pushing people to sign up to your email list, then it'd be great to really have a plan of how you're going to do that, whether that's creating a freebie for your podcast that's aligned to your business. There's a ton of things that you could do in this sense, but having more time on your plate saves you that. You'll also be able to think about partnerships that you might want to have, such as, that could be anything from certain guests to certain, collaborations from businesses. You'll just be able to explore more ways to reach a bigger audience and explore more ways also through marketing strategies. You'll be able to really sit down and realize, okay, I keep saying this, but how is my podcast going to feed into my business? There's so many benefits. You'll also be able to really just improve your process, but the list can go on and on. I really think that, and you could talk to any of my clients where they say that when they finally let go of their podcast editing, or some of them I've been working with since day one, it really saves them time to be able to work more efficiently and put out better content and have time back. Because yes, they're getting their time back, but they're not just using that to chill. I mean, maybe they could. If you want to, do it. But for the most part, you're getting that time back so you can apply that time to better uses in your business. So like I just mentioned, the strategy, the marketing, the connections that you'll make. If you're working, let's say, putting out 4 episodes a month, that's about 10 hours a month, I would say, that you can have back. So what can you do with 10 hours? And with that time, if you're thinking of what do I do next, how do I actually start getting my time back, outsourcing, whatever it is, I really like to prioritize it in order of really what's going to move the needle and what's going to save you the most time. And what I always think here is if you want to outsource a little bit, but you're not sure exactly what you want to outsource, I would think about what you enjoy most about podcasting. And I've had to ask myself this about business and podcasting various times in the past. What is it that I enjoy and what is it that I don't enjoy? So think about, do you enjoy hosting the interviews? Do you like the editing process? Do you like writing show notes? Do you like creating the marketing graphics? There's so many people that can help you with so many different parts of your podcast that it doesn't need to be you hand everything over to one person. You could hire freelancers. You could hire a podcast manager. You could hire a graphic designer, SEO experts, virtual assistants, but it all depends on what you want gone off of your plate. So if it's completely everything, hire a podcast manager. If it's just the editing and you want to do everything else, hire an editor. If it's just the show notes, hire a copywriter. If it's just the social media graphics, hire a virtual assistant or a graphic designer. There's different places that you can really pick and choose of what you want to work on and what you don't. But what I really challenge you to do is sit down and think about your overall podcast strategy. So if you've never done this before, maybe you haven't launched your show or you launched a while ago and you haven't really thought about it much since, this is what I want you to do today, this weekend, whenever you have time, is sit down and think, what do I want to achieve for my podcast? Like, what do I really want to achieve for my podcast? This might be different from what you first intentionally thought when you first started. I've had clients say everything to me from, I want it to bring me some clients every month, to I want it to lead me to a talk show. By creating a brand and really putting content out there, there's so many cool things that we can do with podcasting. There really is. And so think about, what do you want your goal to be in the short term and long term? For most of my clients being business owners, we do want it to bring us revenue, or at least we want it to bring us visibility. And that's really something to get clear on. Do you want your podcast just to get you new content, new eyes on your brand, and then you can do the selling somewhere else? Or do you really want it to be a lead funnel? Get clear on this, because this is really going to help you understand what is important to you and what you can achieve without having it written down or at least planned out. It's really going to be hard, like I mentioned earlier, to continue creating content week after week with like no end in sight. Like really no end in sight. You're like, where is this going to go? And so that's really why I like to set those goalposts that you can reach as you go on. Another point I want to share is, like I mentioned, these goals can change. So continue to come back maybe once a quarter and decide on the podcast strategy. Is it changing? Is everything the same? Do you want to continue the way that you're going? Do you want to make a change? I would schedule one podcast strategy day a quarter with either yourself or your team and really reevaluate where the podcast is going, if you like the direction it's going, and if you're happy with the results you're seeing currently. I also highly encourage you to, on this podcast strategy day, and honestly throughout the months, just see what trends you're seeing in podcasting. Trends are changing. Trends always change. Video podcast is big right now. Cutting clips from your podcast is big right now. What I've been seeing in the business space lately is people being able to repurpose their shows in really cool ways. So for instance, let's say you have a membership and one week you're talking about a certain topic and you have a podcast episode that's about that same topic. You could use that as a resource. I have clients that are authors and teachers, and they actually have their students listen to their podcast because it's going to align with what they're teaching. So for instance, if they're teaching a certain topic, they'll say, I have these 4 episodes for you to go listen to. We're going to be talking about this topic next week, but here's like an additional resource for you to be able to go and learn a little bit more before we dive into the topic. Same goes with maybe anyone with a membership in their business. For instance, I work with a nutritionist, and when she's working with her clients, she'll send podcast episodes to them about what they're experiencing. So she'll have this one-on-one call with them and explain it all. And then she'll say, for more on this topic, like, here's a podcast episode I did, and also here's some other episodes that you might find helpful. That's a way that I don't think most people think about podcasting, because we don't have time if we're working so heavily in the podcast. How can you support your episodes being promoted after they go live? And these are really good ways to do that. And that's just a trend that I'm seeing that's going to continue to grow. So stay on top of trends. That's really my point here. And lastly, I see a lot of people micromanage their podcasts, right? Obviously, it should be great quality, but things can change in your show. And I think this is what holds a lot of people back, right? They don't have the perfect logo or the perfect music, or they don't have this perfect, that perfect. And really, podcasting is a more raw marketing strategy. I only say this because people come to you because they like the way that you talk, and they like the way that you teach, and they like the topics that you're talking about. And it's so different than like these polished social media posts. Really, people can come and see your mannerisms and hear your voice. And it's really just a deeper way to connect with people. So it doesn't need to be 100% perfect. As long as it's good and great, it doesn't need to be micromanaged that every single thing needs to be 100% perfect. And I think if you work with a team, like when I work with my clients, everything is perfect, but they don't have to micromanage it. They can just trust that it's going to be done. But if you're working on it all by yourself, I think that's really where that micromanaging can happen. We're all pretty hard on ourselves. So just give yourself a little bit of grace and stop micromanaging every single thing that goes out. I hope that this episode was helpful. Just to recap, the difference between working on your podcast and in your podcast is when you're working in your podcast, you're probably feeling that overwhelm and stress and kind of resentment towards your show. Whereas if you're working on your podcast, you're seeing that growth and that high level tasks that really can move the needle to get you to the bigger picture that we just drew out a second ago. I would encourage you to really think and see where are you spending the most time on your podcast, and consider outsourcing it and see really where can you free up time to make your life better and your podcast better. You will see a difference when you outsource tasks. You really will. I recently outsourced some stuff from my business, and I have had so much more time on my plate. And it wasn't that much stuff, but it just has given me so much more time to do the things that are actually going to move the needle in my business, which has been so beneficial. So take it from me, outsourcing is the greatest thing I've done, and it could be the greatest thing that you do as well. If you're interested in outsourcing parts of your podcast, you can find my services on my website, espressopodcastproduction.com. I help clients with everything from strategy to launching the podcast to monthly management and editing and show notes, and then also marketing materials as well. So if you're interested, I'll put the link in my show notes where you can book a free 30-minute call with me. But I hope that this episode was helpful. There's so many great podcasts out there that stop because they don't have the right team to support them, or they're not focusing on the right things. And that breaks my heart. It really does, because our voices deserve to be heard. Our message deserves to be heard. And if you're too bottlenecked because your podcast is giving you such a headache to produce every month, but your content is great and you love putting out content, but you stop because you just don't have the time, there's such an easy solution to that. And that's what I'm here to help you with. So let me know if you have any questions, and I will catch you in the next episode. Thank you so much for joining me in the Podcast Cafe. I hope you're leaving with fresh ideas and inspiration to take your podcast to the next level. Remember, podcasting is a journey and you don't have to do it alone. I'm here to help you every step of the way. Let's connect. Be sure you follow me on Instagram at Espresso Podcast Production, or visit espressopodcastproduction.com for more tips, resources, and behind-the-scenes insights. I'd love to hear about your podcasting journey. If you've enjoyed today's episode, make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you're feeling extra generous, I'd love it if you could leave me a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps more podcasters just like you find the show. Until next time, grab your coffee, keep creating, and I'll see you back here in the Podcast Cafe.